So I have been here in Brazil for 2 months, invited as a guest professor by CAPES at UFSC in Florianopolis. There was an extraordinary event when I arrived. For 3 weeks, there were indigenous people, Guarani, Xokleng, and Kangang, who were invited to do a licenciatura. They all, as you know, already teachers. Some are directors of schools. They have lots of responsibilities, political involvement. Some of them are cacique, and but they have to have a diploma to continue to do their work. And I was invited to speak to them about my work with Aboriginal people. And they were the first thing that happened before I even talked. It was a big room, it was 100. And so people with men, women, lots of children, and I was testing the sound, just like now. As he started to sing, all the men laughed. And they stopped, they listened to the end of the clip, and then they all sang, imitated the Warlpiri men singing. So this was before I even started the conference. So I was very touched because I'm very much interested when I think about anthropology, not to classify different societies according to different evolutionist positions of, like in the history of anthropology, or into ontological categories, like some of you might be familiar with the French anthropologist Philippe Discola, who has proposed in his book Beyond Nature and Culture, which is in French. I don't think it's translated in English yet. I looked on the net. Huh? Did anybody know Discola work? Yeah, because he works a lot with Vivero de Castro, and so he divided more or less tendencies of different societies into polarities, where nature and culture is either divided or continuous, and whether inside and outside of the body is continuous or discontinuous. So it creates a polarity of 4 possibilities, and basically he tends to dispatch societies into those 4 different categories. So if the people he worked with, the Chivaro, and other societies of Native Americans are placed into what he calls animism, he took a lot of data, mostly old data, that also was used by Durkheim to write the elementary forms of religious life, Australian data to define another category, which is totemism. And then we have naturalism, which basically is the category of the West. And then you have analogism, which is mostly illustrated in the examples he studies by Asian systems and African divination. Now, if you take this for granted, I mean, it's a very good point, like for Durkheim, to have recognized Aboriginal people as having a social system and religion. Similarly, you can say it's great that Descola is recognizing as valid ways of thought which are different from the Western way of thinking. So he, in a way, gives value to indigenous systems of knowledge which are different, and even proposes to think that maybe the Western paradigm is a bit to be overcome by lessons from other people in the world. Nevertheless, it looks like they are incompatible, non-translatable ways of thinking. And the fact that this indigenous audience here in Brazil first laughed and then imitated, to me, was an example of the fact that they could appropriate themselves something of a completely different culture. It's another language, it's another way of singing, and find a common feature. So what I'm interested in anthropology is to find those, what Félix Guattari, the psychoanalyst analyst and philosopher that wrote many books with Gilles Deleuze, the philosopher, but also wrote lots of things himself, was calling the traits d'intensité, features of intensity. And I believe there is lots of features of sorry. So now I would like to show you, before we continue, another example of feature of intensity. Maybe some of you know the fantastic work that Peter has done on Deligny, who's a French therapist. Your book is out, Peter? Ton livre est sorti sur Deligny, en portugais? Non, pas encore? Ok, mais tu as publié des choses? No? Okay. Well, he just gave us a great conference on that at UFSC. So Deligny was a therapist that inspired a lot Guattari. He was working with autist children, like Peter does. And there are lots of videos that you can look at for free on the net, where you see the kind of work he was doing, experimental work in the 60s, 70s, with autistic children camping in a region of France. And I'll just let you look at it. But there are very strong images where you see one child who is playing with a rope in the landscape. And he's organizing the landscape with this rope, right? And he's doing things with this rope. Now, I would like to show you a film I shot in 1979. It's a healing ritual that the women do. You will see they paint the breast and the belly of a woman who is lying down. And the painting, I will explain more about paintings for Aboriginal people later, but the idea of painting the body with specific designs is first of all thought to feed the body and the mind. So the fact that you do certain designs on the skin are considered as a way of going inside, but the inside where it's not just the inside of the body that suffers. In this case, this woman had terrible pains in her belly, but also if she has pains in the belly means that she suffers in the head. So the purpose of the ritual, it's a woman's ritual called Yaulyu. The same word is also used for other women's ritual to celebrate the links with the land, or to celebrate women's fertility, and basically the reproduction of all the plants, all the animal, the possibility for rain, the control of winds, anything that is named in the society, in nature or culture, which is what in anthropology anthropologists have called totems. For the people, the Warlpiri people, it's called jukurpa. Jukurpa, which is translated by them in English as dreaming. So you have to, from now on, to think totem, what is called totem in Durkheim or any anthropological long history of comments of Aboriginal cosmology, is translated by the many, many languages in Australia. There's over 200 languages. There are different concepts which were translated by anthropologists as totems. It's the dreaming. So you have totems, plural. There are many, many dreamings. Every person can have a constellation of dreamings. If I say, my dreaming is kangaroo, I can also say my dreaming is such and such a plant, sometimes that the kangaroo eats, or I will say my dreaming is rain. And it is us saying, in the literature, it's my totem. But you can see that if you say dreaming, there is a notion which doesn't sound exactly the same as when you say a totem. Because totem, immediately you think about something that is fixed, and for many people it even means an object, right? Now, dreamings can be also object, but basically they are features in the landscape, right? So when you say, this is my dreaming, immediately you say a series of places which are imprints, traces, or parts of the body of the totemic ancestors that traveled. We are in the desert, so traveled through the desert. So imagine you have the rain people who travel, and as they stop, they leave imprints which become hills, depressions, waterholes. This is the dreaming. So if you say, my dreaming is, it's also this story. What in anthropology we call a myth. So dreaming, chukurpa, is totem. It's a myth. And because it's a story that has features in the landscape that are the becomings of those traveling totemic heroes, it's a geographic track. So when a person says, this is my dreaming, they say, this is the series of places that are connected through a story that I'm responsible for, that I'm an owner of. Right? All this is encrypted in that notion. So when a healing ritual is made, you choose designs which are necessarily connected to one of the dreamings. The choice for the design will be not only the dreaming of the person that you want to heal, but it can be a dreaming that has in its mythical stories properties of healing. And it will depend on the kind of disease. So in the case that you are going to see, the clip is very short, so I prefer to explain before and then I won't comment. They choose a snake dreaming, one they will paint. But the second part of the ritual is the same ritual, whatever the dreaming that has been painted. You wrap the body with strings made of hair. Hair are cut at death. You cut the hair of the person who died. You made a bracelet which is circulated between the parents on the maternal side, on the mother side. And it's worn by different mothers' brothers, uncles, brothers of the mother, until it's completely worn. Right? But all the widows, in the case of a man, or other women who are as sister-in-laws for a woman who died, they cut their hair at a death, which means a lot of hair, and hairstring is made and put into circulation. And traditionally, it was almost used, it was creating a value that was used almost in exchanges like money. So between gender, between different kinship groups, and also outside of a given language group to circulate in exchanges with all across of Australia. Right? So it's very important to compare this. I have done that in several publications. If you are interested, I'll make a list. But I think on lattice there is already lots of references to my work. This particular thing I want to refer to is, do you know Annette Weiner, Inalienable Possessions book? Yes? Okay. So I met Annette Weiner in '81, and she was then developing her theory of value produced by women. In her case, it was in Samoa. They were making they were like skirts made of leaves, And she proposed this theory, and then she compared it with many other societies in the Pacific, that in fact women, through those skirts they were producing a value that was essential for the society and circulating between many men. So that was a way to respond to the debates that were happening in those days of excluding the women as being important in the society. And it really illuminated my way of looking at my data Australia to do my PhD, and I said then that those hair strings that the women do in Australia are the equivalent of the mats in Samoa. They produce a value that is essential for the men, for the whole society. And it was important at the time because there was very few people who were giving a role to women as important in the society. But the Aboriginal people themselves were giving this role to their own women because they were starting their claims for land rights, and they asked women to be witnesses in court. If you had only read traditional anthropological stuff, you would say, how come it's the women who are going up front to explain what the society is about, what are the values to the land, what is the cosmology, if they were always excluded? No? Now, still today, even among feminists, there is a very big difficulty to understand that a society can can function with giving value to differences, not just of gender, but any kind of differences. And in a way, Aboriginal societies are a perfect example because you have very small groups who have very different dreamings. So each group that is responsible for a dreaming, in a way, is completely different from the people they marry with and with whom they live in the same society, right? And so the ability to organize in a social system this heterogeneity of identification, which is not essentialism, is really demonstrated in that society. But it's also demonstrated in many other non-Western societies. But for many people still today, it's difficult to accept that if men and women are not doing the same things, they are not in a hierarchical relationship. If men and women are not doing the same thing, that means that women are excluded from what the men do, so they are dominated by men. Right? This is a paradigm which is what many people say. Right? While the difference of activities, such as illustrated in desert societies in Australia, of men having their activities, especially in rituals, women having their own activities, and of course in economy also, traditional economy. The hunting and gathering was not the same for men and women, but in rituals, being separated does not mean that women are excluded. It's a different way of thinking the differences as polarities. So there are situations, of course, where there is domination and violence and so on. But the cosmological idea is not that. So the Yawulu, that is the name of that healing ceremony that I will show you, is given to all ceremonies that women do, from which men are excluded. And traditionally, if a man would see a ceremony like that, he could be killed. He was not supposed to be on the ground where the women do their ceremonies. And in English, Aboriginal people of the desert in the 60s, 70s have translated all their ritual activity by the word business. So people in charge of rituals, and any adult is, because any adult is responsible to paint on the body his dream and her dreaming, to dance, to sing, to look after the country, everybody, men and women. They called businessmen, businesswomen. With time, with the development of land rights, very often they say they low men, low women. Low, like the law, right? So this language that is used by the Western system of justice or injustice, whatever, is appropriated as translations of the roles. So you are going to, I'm not commenting anymore. In fact, I am sorry I don't have the right film. I just suddenly realized it's on the disc here. But the film that I will show you anyway, it's the end of the a ceremony where some 20 boys, still in 79, boys, young men between 18 and 22, have stayed with the men for 5 months in the bush to be initiated. There's a second level of initiation. First level was the circumcision at 10 years. 10 years. So this is the second level, and they have seen a lot of very special ceremonies only for men. And during all this time, the women were doing their own ceremonies to accompany their sons, their brothers, their nephews, and so on. And what is important here is that every day men, the bosses, ritual bosses of the men and the women, would meet and decide together what to enact, what story, what dreaming to enact separately, right? So the polarity here is that the same traveling is painted on the body, danced and sang separately by men and women, but they travel on the same routes from place to place in their rituals, right? Without going to the place necessarily, during the initiation. And after 5 months, the women are invited to the men's ground and for the boys to come out of initiation. And the boys are covered with hair string and also cloth, which now is added to hair string. So there is no sound in this film. Now I would like to show you a film which was made in 2011. In the 1970s, 80s, all those paintings that people were painting on their bodies and on objects, they started to paint on canvas. And any of you know those paintings? Have seen such paintings? Yeah? Everybody? Okay. So there, in Lajamano, where I've been working since '79, Yuliulu, Lorna Fenson-Naburula, started to paint when she was in her late 70s. And she painted thousands of paintings. She could paint a painting a day. And they have been sold all over the world, like artists. And they are displayed in private collections and in contemporary art museums. And when she died, there was an exhibition organized for her, and with a selection of some of her paintings from different institutions and private collections. And the Lajamano women, the same that you just saw there in '79, the one who did not die, but that same group, some of them who were in that film as younger women, were invited to open the exhibition. And that's so you can see she's digging the ground, like for the yams, and that was a yam painting. Now, a last thing that I would like to show before the PowerPoint. There is a Warlpiri teacher that you just saw in the film. It was Wanta. You saw maybe a man. Did everybody saw a man coming to the painting and touching the painting? the bushes that the women had in their hands are like the bushes they use at the death of a person to chase away the spirit in the community, away from the places where the person used to go, right? Like to clean the places. We'll talk more about that this afternoon with relationship to images. But in that case, so the women first have gone all around the gallery where all the paintings were to brush away the spirit of that person, Yululu, the artist who had done the paintings. But Wanta, I mean, the spirit in things is not just a negative, polluted thing. It's just a powerful thing. So it has to be controlled in a certain way. So you chase it away so it doesn't do you harm if you don't know how to control it. But you also try to imbue yourself with the power that is in the object. And that's exactly what Wanta has done. He walked to the painting, to touch the painting, to get the strength from the art that the artist put in the painting by doing it. Right? So he put his hand on the painting. Now, Wanta has been collaborating with a theatre called Trax in Darwin, which is about 1,500 kilometers north from Lajamanu in the desert. And he had this vision, this concept of organizing a festival in his community to try to involve young kids into perpetuating their culture, because they spend more time on watching videos, and also lots of depression, I mean violence, petrol sniffing, suicides and so on. So to involve them, because they listen to the music that the whole world, young generation is listening, hip-hop, he offered them to participate in this show doing hip-hop, but their first language is still Warlpiri, with the elders who would perform on the same stage their dreamings like they do in rituals. So this you can see again on YouTube. The festival is called Warlpiri, which is a cloud. I'm sorry, I will tell you one more thing, because the film opens like that. I shouldn't make it full screen. This particular festival here is called Pulyarani, which is a place of a wind dreaming. And the story is that there was a big bushfire, and people asked for the wind, the north wind, to stop the fire, and he couldn't. He had not enough power. Then they asked the southern wind to do it. He had not enough power. And then the eastern wind, and then the west wind, and none of them could do it. But then they put together their strengths, and they could stop the bushfire. So this is the dreaming of Pulyarani, is you need the four winds to be able to do something. Every dreaming has this kind of concept. So a dreaming is a becoming. So any word has this becoming. So we could talk for hours about any of those concepts, but we'll talk again later. But here it is. This is the wind dreaming. But in the festival there are elements also of some other dreamings, which I will comment as we go. For big screen, I'll bring the sound down a bit. Is the okay? Sorry. So the song is a mix of Warlpiri and English, and they repeat the names of the four winds. What happens? Okay. So they're extracts of the festival that happened all night. Now you notice the the kids have 4 colors. This corresponds to 4 kinship groups. I will explain later. And the paintings behind are made especially for the show, but each of them has specific dreaming designs. Like just behind now, tracks from the wallaby, little kangaroos. Here, budgerigar, the little birds. The imprints on the men on their knees here are the wampana, the wallaby. It's that design.
Who chose the song?
For the clip, this is not at all the sound during the festival, it's a pity. Yeah, well, it's maybe the track company who put it online. I prefer it without it. This here is an extremely important ceremony, witi. Young men have those branches fixed to their feet just before the circumcision of a boy. It's a ceremony where everybody laughs. It's considered as very erotic. And men and women are very excited in the crowd. And just after that, the boy is taken. This is the snake that connects groups from many places. This was just the old man that we saw singing before. The snake dreaming connects many, many groups across Australia. This particular snake. It's a ceremony of resolution of conflicts. At the end of the ceremony, all the bushes are burned. Okay. I very quickly run through the PowerPoint. Yeah? Another 10 minutes, is that okay? Sorry, where on this computer is to make it big? Otherwise we can leave it like that. It's not really a problem. You see here the photo was taken in 1984. The Warlpiri are marching in the closest city called Catherine with the flag that was designed in 1972 when many activists put a tent embassy in front of the parliament in Canberra saying we have a flag. Now on the map they designed it in 79. It was an Aboriginal artist. You see the little patches of colors are all the languages of Australia. It's always this map that is reproduced, but it gives a false idea because you have the impression, it shows the number of languages, but it gives the impression that you have neat boundaries between the different groups, which is not the case at all. And since they can do land claims, there's maybe 900 land claims going on at the moment. Now, what happened? Well, I don't have, okay. There is about 900 claims going on, but very few claims have been satisfied. But there is maybe 1/4 of the central and northern part of Australia that is under title that belongs to Aboriginal people now. But the government is constantly developing different ways of taking away the power that he gives through very complex legal procedures. So here it's another important historical element. Two Warlpiri are filming women which are walking at a sacred site and stopping at every stone which has a connection to a specific dreaming. Several dreamings cross in that place, and so most of the big rocks are the bodies of the possums, which are little marsupial that hangs on by its tail down. But other places are connected to a snake or to plums or to little different birds. And so the women here decided to make a film to protect the place from being destroyed by a mining company. Now, if you like, you can copy that link, because I invite you to look a series that was shown on Australian TV and made with many Indigenous scholars to tell the history of Australia and of the first Australians in a different way than it's usually talked about in Australia, and specifically by choosing, since the colonization some over 200 years ago till the 1990s, to choose a series of men and women that were extremely active politically to resist against the very violent colonization and all the institutional tricks to destroy not only Aboriginal society but Aboriginal souls. And so everything is online, so you can watch the episode. There is 6 episodes of 1 hour, and in each episode there is 2 people, the story of 2 people that are chosen. And in this particular episode 4, it's the story of the Erenta who inspired Durkheim's elementary forms. And you will see how Spencer and Gillen arrive among the Erenta. What they don't say in their book is that there has already been a lot of very violent history, and you look at the film and you will see by yourself. Okay, this is the film that I showed you with the Maliara initiated the hairstring at the classe was in 79. Now this ceremony was passed in fact from group to group of different languages, and in 84 the Warlpiri gave it to the Pitjantjatjara near Ayers Rock. You all in Docker River, you all know the big probably red monolith that is in the heart of Australia. So we traveled on this track for 2,000 kilometers to do that. And it's a very secret ceremony. Now, you saw in the film the 2 sticks that were used by the women that embodied the 2 ancestral women for that particular ceremony. In another ceremony, the sticks are erected in the same way, connected with the hairstring to embody another ancestral dreaming. It depends what you do. And you see here a pile of blankets, which are also used as gifts between different members of the groups who celebrate. This is seen from close how the hairstring looks. It's made by, I forgot the word in English. You just do this like that with the hair, and it weaves itself. This is not on Warlpiri land, but there are Warlpiri people who live there because they intermarried. Near Balgo, those 2 hills here represent the ancestors of the 2 the ancestors of the healers, of the shamans. But we can talk about that in the discussion if you are interested. Here is an example of a type of dream revelations that men and women have, more often women in fact, where they see a Yaulyu, donc ceremonies, in their dreams, which are new designs and new verses of songs that can be added to the inherited body of songs and dances and designs for any given dreaming ancestor. So I let you read the text. And what is important here is that she's saying that she saw in her dream designs not for her dreaming, but for another group. So she actually dreams. Somebody has difficulty to read the words? I see. You want me to read it? Or maybe somebody... You can't see it? It's too small? Okay, long time ago I received a yaulyu for the yam jukurba, the yam dreaming, that belongs to the Nakamara and Aburula skin. This is the Warlpiri, like the Aranda, half of the Aranda, have a system where they have 8 different skin names. So this was for that group. She is a Nakamara, but it's not her dreaming. Munga Munga, Munga Munga is the concept for the matrix, the powers of the dreaming when you sleep, that is a virtuality that gives you this creativity of songs and designs and rituals. My mother gave me in dreams, so her real mother, 4 designs to paint on the body. Since then, in Lajumano and Yuendumu, which is another Warlpiri community, women always dance decorated with these paintings to celebrate the land of Yumurpa, which is a sacred place for this Yauryu. The first design is the Jijardu yam flower, we call father. From there run the Wapirti roots, we call mother. On these mother roots, young roots, Ngamana develop, the children who give the yams. The last design is Mardi, the old man, the edible yam, which terminates the young roots that spread everywhere. So this is really the description of a rhizome. And just like you have the description of rhizome used as a concept in Deleuze and Guattari rhizome, Mille Plateaux, and rhizome that they wrote before it was integrated to Mille Plateaux. So what I was telling you before about Pularani, the 4 winds being the concept of you need joint forces to be able to stop a fire. Here, the concept is the rhizome, the yam is the concept of the rhizome, is that the connections, right? All night, the spirit of my mother helped me to learn. So in the morning, I was able to teach and paint on the chest the 4 designs. I also painted the yukurukuru board, which is what the men call the churingas. You have that in many, many museums in the world. There is lots of collectors, explorers, stealers who stole this from Aboriginal people. And it started with Spencer and Gillen. And Gillen in the TV series is actually, there is an extract of his diary where he says, if I had known how important it was for the Arenda, I would have never taken all these objects away to put in museums. But there was a real traffic, which actually continues today. So women also have their own boards, which they call yukurukuru, on which they paint those dreaming designs. And showing those boards in court for land rights in the 70s was a way to prove your connections to the land, like a written title. So she also painted the Pilkardi design, which is an adder, a little snake, which is actually connected to the yam dreaming, because the way the snake goes underground forces the tubers to emerge on the surface. I mean, to be available for people to eat. Okay. This is an example of a Warlpiri painting where you remember the place I show you with the possum, the rocks. Well, here you see the traveling of the ancestors right up to the Yardulu, the same place, which is here in the center. And it's crossed by the traveling of the Wampana, the Wallaby ancestors, the track that you saw in the Milperi festival. And in the top you have women represented by half circus with their shields, who are collecting seeds, and the acacia seeds which are used to make bread, and the bread is also the ovals, and these seeds are connected with the traveling of the dreaming, which is a constellation with the Wallaby, Wampana, who were traveling with the big snake that you saw in the festival. And it's a ceremony that is, this dreaming, the concept of this dreaming, it's not a metaphor, is a resolution of conflict. the snake was carried by the wallabies. The ancestors of the wallabies were carrying the snake on their shoulders, and everywhere where they stopped, they did a bit fire ceremony to make people settle their disputes. Here you see actually Lorna Fencer is the artist that had this huge exhibition that I showed you an extract of before. So this was before her death, and here she's actually dancing the role of the dream that the woman that you saw before has dreamt. So with another Naburula woman, they are acting the ancestral men, the little yam and small yams that fought, and now are related to two different local groups who are in a company relationship of being like brothers, and they cannot fight. They do sometime, but the dreaming here is the dreaming again to remind that there was a fight in the dream space time, but you have to try to make peace. Two of my students here were making a presentation on the Kimberley, which is the western side of Australia. Lajamanu is maybe 100 kilometers to the east-south here. And this is an example of exchanging of hair string, boomerangs, spears, and other things between different groups with the desert. And this system is called the Wunan. And the Wunan, the origin story of the Wunan is among the Ngarinyin, who are people who live in the north, in the plateaus, and were still doing in the 60s rock art by repainting the old rock art, which is several thousand years old. Now, Martin Préau and Arnaud are working with groups in the Kimberley. Here, David Maljali is a Ngarinyin man who passed away now, but he fought for 70 years in court to get the land of his people back, and it's only after his death that the land was given back to the Ngarinyin. But partly because he came to France with 3 other elders, and he was asking UNESCO to recognize those extraordinary rock art. There is hundreds and hundreds of paintings like that just in their country. So the people who have the story of the origin of the Wunan system of exchange with language groups in other places. And here you see on back the Wandjina with no mouth, which are the figures, the totemic dreaming ancestors related again to rain and all the dreamings in this rock art. And he was asking UNESCO to recognize those places as world heritage, to protect them, because at the time, this was 1997, and I talk about that in Rêve en colère, my book, one of the books. They were threatened by diamond mining, by the Bria that operates in South Africa. And the Australian government didn't like at all the fact that Aboriginal people would ask an international body in those days, 96, 97, to intervene in Australia. In Australia at the time there was not one of those sacred places, there are thousands, not just rock art, but other places which were recognized as intangible heritage. World Intangible Heritage in Australia. There were several places which were recognized as natural heritage, but no cultural heritage. So this was the first attempt that Maljali did. It was blocked. At the time, there was a traffic on some of those paintings. There was networks of people who were going in the Kimberley and cutting away some of those stones. And one of the men who was facilitating that had lots of influence among politics and among the media. You all know that it's an Australian man who is holding many, many newspapers across the world. And so this family actually were supporting this man who was doing this appropriation of this rock art. And they wrote to to UNESCO when these 4 elders were there, and lots of archaeologists and specialists of rock art were ready to support this action. They wrote and said that they were not eligible to speak in the name of the Ngarinyin. And this is the sort of things that you see very often, but I really invite you to search on the web for the word here, Guion. It's the name of a book that was published by those 4 elders with a filmmaker, small Guion, very tiny little figures, and the discourse of this this guy who wanted to appropriate himself this rock art was to say that when the first white people came to the rocks, to this region in the 19th century, they asked Aboriginal people what was the meaning of those little figures, and there was no answer. So it's not theirs. It was made by other people before, right? And so they are called the Bradshaw figures for those who are interested in rock art. Bradshaw being the name of the so-called discoverer of those paintings. And Maljali and the other 3 old men decided to talk about the Guion when they needed to protect the places. And there are hours and hours of extraordinary films by Jeff Doring, which were displayed in Melbourne in a big contemporary art space as a multiple screen installation. And in the book, which is in English, in German and French, you have the words of Maljali and the other 3 old men, and it's just extraordinary. But you have some people who would say, this is not authentic. It's invented tradition. Okay, but we can talk about that in the discussion. I believe it's a demonstration indeed of poetic creativity in the way you express those links. But if you read the text, not just anybody is able to write or say things like that. And the way it's connected with the Wunan, those exchanges that were documented from the beginning, that the Europeans were in this region where there was lots of massacres, and despite the fact that people were forced to sedentary life, they were living on farms, they were disappearing regularly, and this was making the whites really mad, saying they can't work and so on, because they had to do their Wunan exchanges, carry the things from one place to another. And it's the Wunan roots that were also used later for political solidarity, especially in 1980, where in Nunkamba they wanted to destroy another place related to big iguana, you would say here, iguana, for petrol, the Amax company. And there was through the Wunan, there was a huge solidarity between all the Aboriginal groups who opposed to this destruction of this place. But at the time, the unions were also very involved in Australia in supporting Aboriginal people, which is not the case anymore. And part of the economy was blocked for a few months, trying to stop a big convoy that was a drilling convoy that was traveling all across the Western West from Perth down south to bring the equipment to start drilling in Nkamba. I was at the time there too, on the road, with squatting with everybody, and 1980. And it was a very important time, and it's the Wunan that was used. So, too bad for people who can't understand and are lost in the word authenticity. This is the art cooperative of Warlpiri Art Center in Lajamano. I will show you more this afternoon. This is Lajamanu, so you can see on one hand through the paintings you have massive amount of money that can arrive, like for Lorna, the paintings are sold very expensive. On the other hand, people still live like that, which is not necessarily a sign of poverty, right? Because these old ladies, those artists, some of them who have traveled in Sydney, in Europe last June, in New York or whatever, they like to sleep outside, right? We had a very interesting conversation about that with the Guarani and Shocklang. Now, inside a house, sleeping on the floor, and what is not on the photo here, the television, right, is important. Not necessarily to see films from the television, but DVDs, and also, if you have internet, to go on the net, and Facebook. Now, we don't have internet today, this morning, so is everybody coming this afternoon? Or not necessarily? Well, then copy the link, because this is a very, here we see Andrew Johnson Japananka, who is inciting people to vote for the first Aboriginal party that was created last year. It's the grandson of a very famous Aboriginal man called Lingari, who has run the second big strike in Australia in the 1960s. And this party is the first Aboriginal party. There has been lots of Aboriginal people involved in politics, but it's the first time in history that there is an Aboriginal party. And one of the reasons to create this party was to react to a law that was passed in Australia. It's called the Northern Territory Emergency Intervention, which delegations of militaries, policemen, doctors went to 73 Aboriginal communities to check if children were raped. And this was 6 years ago. And when this happened, the people got very, very upset. It reminded them what many women have experimented in this region between the 1940s and 1970s, in other regions right from 1905, the taking away of children of lighter skin from women who have been raped or who had a love story with non-Aboriginal men. And many women ran away with their children to hide in the desert at the time. And the government decided that because there was a report of maltreatment and violence in communities, they decided to take away from 73 communities in the Northern Territory all the system of self-determination that was ruling their places since the 1970s, since the time I started to work there. So the situation is quite critical now, because this Northern Territory intervention is finished since last year, but the government has installed a new system, a new law, which is doing the same thing, which is really treating again the Aboriginal people like children. So, but they react like that. But I invite you to copy the link if you can see it, or otherwise we will. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not. It's hidden partly. Anyway, if you type Lajamanu and the law on YouTube, you might just arrive on it. If not, I'll send the links to Dominique. And now the last story I would like to say, and of course I talked much longer than I said I would, till we stop at 12, and the discussion is important. Again, just type Palm Island on internet. My last book was called Guerrier pour la paix. For those who are interested, there is a translation free online in English. The man you see here on the right, that's his brothers and sisters, Lex Wotton, was accused of a riot on Palm Island after the deaths of Cameron Doomadgee, who was killed to death by a policeman. And the book, I wrote the book with him, and this is a whole other field in Australia of police violence and death in custody and social injustice. So the policeman was finally trialed but freed, while Lex, who was accused of being the ringleader of the riot that burned the station without any policeman being wounded, took 6 years of jail. And he was freed after 2 years, but he's not allowed to speak in public. So for instance, he had set up on his island a men's group against alcohol and violence. And because he cannot speak in public, he is not allowed to run his men's group. So this is an example of Australian government schizophrenia, the real one. Okay, well, let's have a discussion now, but this petition was written in 1988 to the government, and I just leave that for the discussion. All the things that the people were asking in 1988, I put in brackets what has been satisfied and what is not. Okay? Yes?
So, at the time of transformation, all those processes generate in ways of dream.
All process generates in dream, not all process.
All those transformations,
yes.
static transformations, political.
Yeah.
And, how do all those things impact in dreams ways, dreaming ways of expression or
well,
action and ritual ways of action?
Okay, well, not necessarily directly. It depends of the period in time and of the place. There has been a time during first contact, and there is a text that talks a lot about that, which is called, I forgot how I called it, I'm sorry, but I'll give you the reference. It's what I call the historical ritual. There are rituals where people deal with the violence of colonization, but right from the beginning. So in 1912 there was a boat that disappeared on the west coast called the Kumbana, and this boat was transporting the kids taken away from their families to pensions in the south. It was taking men who were fighting to keep their land. They were chain gained and taken to an island called Rottnest Island, from which they could not escape, and also lepers. So the boat was used both ways to take lepers to another island and a leprosarium. So there was lots of suffering on this boat, and when it disappeared, it was never found. The wreckage was never found. 1912, an Aboriginal man dreamt a ceremony that took 60 years to travel from group to group, and the ceremony is a reenactment of the violence of colonization. And the missionaries at the time were extremely opposed to this ceremony to be enacted, because they could see that it was not just a ritual, it was the people were there working at the resistance. I mean, physically, ritually, redesigning the dreaming law into what they called the two laws. There is lots of ritual roles which think about redesigning the roles of men and women, the young people, old people, to give a place to people of mixed descent, and so on. But they were calling this a devil business, the missionaries, right? They were saying this is demoniac, right? Because they could feel that there was a danger there. But this traveled, and I witnessed it in La Germano in 1979. This ritual continued to travel until 1988, and since then I'm not aware of the ritual use in politics, because in a way people then, with the dates that you see here, thought other ways to be able to fight for political achievements. But because they are not satisfied, there is actually a personal involvement back into the dreaming, right? So people are in a search, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, of their family histories. There was a huge search of children who have been taken away to find out through archives that were kept by the Australian government, but to access those archives to find who their families are, from what tribes they were taken away, to go back and meet. There was lots of hurting meetings. Some families did not wanted to have the children, then adults, to come back, or sometimes the people who did not know that they were Aboriginal did not wanted to know about it, or they completely collapsed when they found out that they were Aboriginal and that they were coming from those communities. But in other cases, it has completely changed their life. So there is a completely new dynamic according to the different regions. And one of the things that we were discussing yesterday at CESTA is that indeed, when people have lost their language, have lost their family ties into a tribe, have lost their land, don't practice rituals, have become Christians or just have no religions or whatever, one of the first things that very often happens is to explore your dreams and to dream names for the children, which give them dreaming. I mean, it's a singular exploration. But I don't believe that this is in opposition to the collective way of working dreams, because I don't believe that Aboriginal societies were organized in the way that Durkheim defines it, right? That it was all sociocentric. There is a beautiful work written by an American anthropologist, Fred Myers, who have shown how much, with the Pintubi people, how much it's the autonomy that is recognized, the singularity.
I would like to know if in your fieldwork you have noticed something that cannot be shown for the white man. Some designs or some dreamings.
In the beginning, everything. In the beginning, everything, because men and women don't do the same thing. So women cannot see what the men do, and vice versa. Men cannot see what the women do in those rituals. So all these designs, even some that I showed you, in 79 were not supposed to be shown. Right? When I filmed, like the women, for instance, dancing, at the time, I was told, when you go back to your country, you only show it to women. Now, I thought at the time, because it was 79 and there was the feminist movements and all that it was fantastic only to show it to women, because we women were searching for ways to redefine us as women. And I have an old book called Les Rêveurs du Désert, the Dreamers of the Desert, in which I have a whole chapter of what happened when I showed the film to only women in Paris. And for me it was a disaster, because I had just experienced for all those months in the desert an incredible something with those women, which had completely redefined what being a woman for me was. And this feeling of, at the same time, developing a new way of being with others, through others, and then not being able to share it in that room with those women. And but not with all. There were some women who understood, but others could not. So I felt like I had betrayed the Warlpiri women. But then things got better. And the main thing is that this is why I showed you those films in the beginning. When the Warlpiri started to paint, they did it later than the Pintubi. First, a group of 12 men came to Paris in 1983. They were invited by the Peter Brookes Theatre and by the Museum of Contemporary Art. They performed there, and just then at the Australian Embassy, for the first time, were displayed in France those extraordinary paintings made by the Pintubi I was referring to before. And the war women were there was 12 of them, they were very shocked, and they said this should not be shown to anybody, right? This was on canvas. And they came back, and because of those links that they have between groups of different languages, they called a meeting with the Pintupi elders and with the Pichanjara and with the Erenda and with Kaitish and other men. And they decided, and they talked about that, and they asked the Pintupi people not to paint certain designs, not to paint them in certain ways, and certain stylistic decisions were taken of what you can show or not show. And so this would 79, but 5 years later, the Warlpiri, the same men and women, started to paint on canvas because they had got their land back. They saw that the paintings were a way of proving to the world their links with the land, and so they decided this strategy that it should travel around, and also it was a way of being economically independent. Right? And they had already asked the women to talk in court to defend their land, and then they asked the women to dance, to present the painting to the outside. So the women started to show some of their designs and dances. And when I worked on a multimedia device for them, but also for outside, to explain how all this works, there was long negotiations on what could be shown or not, and I will talk more about it this afternoon. So there are still certain things that you don't show. But if I look now at the Warlpiri festival, for instance, and what they have chosen to show or not, it's interesting because it's different from what they would have decided 20 years ago. They would have never put, for instance, the dance, the witty dance with the big leaves, because it's specifically something, a dance you do for a boy who is going to be circumcised. So the whole community is there, but it belongs to the initiation of that boy. So question, I mean, some people again would say, oh, well, this is just a festival for, you know, it's not authentic, is it? I think, again, I agree with you that there is a problem with the music, but in a way, it's protecting, right? It's protecting what is actually happening there, because it's in Lajamanu, the audience is entirely Aboriginal, it's for them, and there, each dance has the singing like you heard in the opening of the exhibition, and the men sing, the women sing. Then when the boys dance hip-hop, it's hip-hop. I think they probably could not put the hip-hop songs for copyright reasons also, because over there they use just hip-hop songs and so on. So yeah, in a way it's a screen. It's a shield to put this music. No questions? Or comments? Yes?
You were talking about authenticity, that this word doesn't mean much for you. And in this case of the festival, where all the audience was Warlpiri, I can understand. But my doubt is about situations where Aboriginal people enact, perform their culture for tourists or for white audiences. Okay. I have seen that in Australia, in Cairns.
Yeah.
There is Aboriginal Cultural Center, where you pay a fee and then you get face painting, and you can learn how to throw sparrows.
Well, on this particular experience, I have a very good friend, Rosita Henry. She's the co-editor of the book, The Challenge of Indigenous People, professor at James Cook University in Townsville, which also has a campus in Cairns. She just published a book in English on Cairns. It's an extraordinary ethnography, but old already, from the beginning, from the 70s, how the hippies invested that region in those days. It's before the creation of the center. and the alliances and conflicts that there were in the place with very rich cane sugar owners, very rich business people, miners of that region, military, the hippies, different waves of hippies, and Aboriginal people. Rosita Henry. So I also passed the link for that book. It was published by Bergen. Henry, Henry. And she's responding to your question. Because the Jabukai is the name of the language group there, they were completely squashed by colonization. In Queensland, it was one of the worst way of treating people. So they were not allowed to speak their language for many generations already. They were, of course, not allowed to do their rituals, and very often the groups in Queensland, the strategy of the government in Queensland was to take people to different reserves, to divide them. The Warlpiri were lucky. They were displaced, forced to sedentarization, but stayed together, right? While in Queensland, people were sent away to different missions. And so the continuity of their link to land was very difficult to maintain. To claim land, you have to demonstrate the continuity of your link, the language, the rituals, and so on. That's in the Western law that has adapted this proof. It's a trick. So what happened with the Jabukai, with the center, they started to dream. They dreamt those songs, dances, and so on, and they grew up like Western kids. They're very often of mixed descent. So to me, in the beginning, the first years of Jabukai was extraordinary. And there has been many experiences like that elsewhere. There's a beautiful film made by an Aboriginal filmmaker who recently won a prize in Cannes for a film called The Sapphires. Any of you have seen this film? It received an award last year. It's a story of 3 sisters and a cousin, Aboriginal girls from places like Cairns, further south, it's during the Vietnam War. They have beautiful voices, they sing country, and they meet a guy, type of hippie guy, and who is a music promoter and a bit lost. And one of the girls sees an announcement that you can go to Vietnam to tour, and they ask him to organize them a tour. They're very young at the time. He's going to. And thanks to this tour they're going to do during the war of Vietnam, they will become extremely famous, the Sapphires. It's a real story, but it's made into a fiction. And the actors are great. And you see the atmosphere in the 60s, because the Aboriginal people were very inspired by what was going on in America with Martin Luther King, Black Panthers, and so on. And through an experience like that of being in Vietnam with all those black soldiers and so on. So it's the filmmaker who did Sapphires did a film which is about exactly what you saw at Jabukai. It's 4 boys who play in this sort of cardboard type of stage for tourists every day, several times a day, the same show about the dreaming, they paint, but at the same time one of them has been raped by his father-in-law, another one is asthmatic, another one is beaten every day, but they come to this and they live. It's existential territory for them, for their families. It's a beautiful little short film. It's called Jan Jan. Yeah.
Alors, comment ça se passe, la participation des aborigènes à l'académie? C'est l'anthropologie reçoit la façon de voir le monde et l'archéologie aussi, c'est la participation collaborative. Non seulement de la façon de faire la théorie, mais incorporer la théorie, la cosmologie, la vision des mondes aborigènes. Ça se passe et bon.
Not enough. There is lots of conflicts, and now there are in some universities departments of Indigenous studies where there is an attempt to pass the Indigenous system of knowledge, but there are some extraordinary scholars who can do very strong presentations or who organize their courses to invite people from communities to come and speak. Or everywhere in Australia you have elders who had an experience, a historical experience of the violence of colonization, who come to share that and how they survived, how they resisted, even if it's fragmented, the knowledge that they have of the different places that they grew up in, Sydney, in Canberra, in Melbourne, whatever, everywhere. But in the 90s, it was imposed in the curriculums to teach about colonization of Australia. Not necessarily, I mean, there were some very good curriculums that were prepared, but they were not necessarily used. So it was up to the teachers to tell what they wanted to do, and they did not often do it very well. It was not monitored enough. The result was that when the children finish school, they don't want to hear about it. Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal? Non-Aboriginal because it means designating as guilty them as descendants of the colonizers, and Aboriginal kids because they feel shame. And so many students who arrive at the university, even though it's also compulsory to have an initiation to Aboriginal issues, Aboriginal history and ways of seeing, they don't want to go. They had enough, but they don't know anything. Now, there are some other initiatives which are fantastic. For instance, last August when I was in Lajamanu, there was a whole class of, it would have been probably 15, 16 years old from Melbourne who came on a project. They funded themselves to come to Lajamanu to meet the Warlpiri people at the art center, to have for 2 days the Warlpiri at school, to explain to them what it is to be a Warlpiri, the language, the kinship, and they were enthusiastic. Now, the 4 colors that you saw, like blue, yellow, green, and red, was a way by Wanta to designate the different kinship groups. And so in the school they were taught about the kinship and allocated a name by different Warlpiri people each, so they have a color. And I saw them coming to the art center, and their first question was, I want to buy a painting, which is my color. See? And so there are those initiatives, but it's very often some people only, right? It's very difficult to respond at the university. And then there are conflicts between the Indigenous Studies departments and anthropology. Then you have lots of anthropologists who earn a lot of money in land rights, and even though they might have written some very good ethnography, they're not really helping in to change the law out of what they know of the specificity of the cosmology. The game of those land rights is constantly, I'll give you an example, it's constantly rejecting where I believe is the power of those systems of knowledge. For instance, the Wunan, right? The exchange. When I was living in the Kimberley for several years, in the 90s, we had lots of talks with other anthropologists, and I was asked to propose ideas about doing the land claims and so on. And my idea was to have regional land claims based on the Wunan. And lots of Aboriginal people, like the Ngarinyin, wanted it to be done that way. And at the time, the choice of the lawyers and the anthropologists who were paid by the lawyers to prepare the land claims was to say, no, we should do group by group. And then it became, a group needs to be incorporated, I mean legally, to become an incorporation. So language groups have become enterprises. And then inside the language groups, people had conflicts of interest because, as you understand, with the system of dreamings and itineraries, a place can be common to two groups, right? So people started to create corporations for local groups inside the language group. So in Broome, where I was living, you had in 1992 12 corporations created in 1 year. They were all people who shared the same land, but they were all put in conflict for land claims. And so here is the problem. But it's a problem for anthropology, but it's a problem for the world generally. Because I believe we have a lot to learn from that way of thinking of indigenous people, not to divide land and society or thinking into categories with boundaries, but the whole judicial system is not accepting that. But if you go again on the first Australian series, you will see how Aboriginal people across the different generations have managed to challenge those things. The last episode, number 6, is the story of Eddie Mabo. He was a gardener at James Cook University. He was going to the library and then was going to the seminars of the historians who at the time, in the early 1990s, before, late 70s, were starting to change the way history was taught in Australia, and talking about the hidden history of massacres and so on. And he had this idea of challenging the government on the concept of terra nullius, which was the basis of the colonization of Australia, not recognizing that Aboriginal people were the owners of the country, so that the country was empty of people. Right? They were just passing by. And it was only challenged by the lawyers in the 80s. It took 12 years, and they won in 92 after the death of Eddie Mabo. But in the episode, it's really interesting, the lawyers say, we didn't believe it will work, see? And many anthropologists don't believe, when they're doing the land claims, that they can win by changing the paradigm. And for me, it's very shameful as an anthropologist that it's not possible to do that when the tools are there. It's just lots of extraordinary indigenous people have died now who managed to change many things. It's like the success of the art, it was like the success of the land rights movement. They have managed to change the law as it goes, but it's constantly, the pressure of the institution is constantly squeezing it in universities, in anthropology, in law, in the government, in the places. But the important thing to remember is that, and this is again a tool, in 70% of the economy in the north of Australia, central and north, where 40% of the population is Aboriginal, is based on Aboriginal business. But so there is some Aboriginal people who earn money from that, but there is lots of non-Aboriginal people who earn money from that. So it's really an economical war to maintain Aboriginal people under this constraint.
Mais par exemple, ça existe des étudiants qui font faire l'anthropologie ou l'archéologie.
Oui, aborigènes, oui, tout à fait. We have, there's, at James Cook in 2005, there was a student doing a degree, Lance Sullivan. He actually had his scholarship paid by a mining company. He was coming from the desert, so he was the first one coming from Bulia. And he wrote a book on his language. And again, interesting story. He sent it to the only linguist that had worked on his group, Yelangarga. And there's almost no speakers anymore. It's just at the crossing of Queensland and Northern Territory and Western Australia, South Australia. It's just there, the region. Very important region for exchange of pituri, which was a narcotic. And he sent that to this linguist, and the linguist responded, I cannot write introduction to you because your transcription of the language is wrong. You have to redo it. And so it's Rosita Henry, my friend at James Cook, who was then his supervisor, who wrote the introduction. And this is the sort of things that happen. And his reaction was to say, well, I understand that there is the linguist convention, but my audience is the young generation in my group, and they speak English. So I need to transcribe my language in the way English speakers would transcribe the sounds. As an example, oo, the sound oo, is double O in English, like in football, right? Oo. And in linguistics, you write, the convention is you. He says, I cannot write you because they are going to read it ah, right? Like in cup. So there is this conflict constantly. But I encourage you, I'm really hoping for an Indigenous scholar, Max Lenoy from James Cook, to come to Brazil end of May at a conference that we organize at UFSC.
I'd like to know more about the filmmakers and how, if there's any kind of difference between the way they started to transform dreams into canvas and the way they can transform dreams into movies and other media productions. Is there any kind of controversies on that?
Again, if you're coming this afternoon? No. If we have internet, I can show you examples. And if for those who don't come, I'll give you the links. You can already note, because if you type on YouTube, you will arrive directly on that, the Mulka project, M-U-L-K-A. It's a group in the north of Australia, the Yolngu. Some of you maybe, there is a Yolngu actor who was very famous in Hollywood. David Gulpilpil. He played in many famous films. You just don't know he was Aboriginal. He's a big black man. You know maybe Crocodile Dundee? You remember an Aboriginal man there who was making a joke with the white crocodile hunter? You don't. This is a very important question. So we can talk more about it. The invisibility, right? It's a great scene because the crocodile hunter cannot hunt crocodiles without an Aboriginal guy, can he? So he's there. And it's played by David Gulpilpil, who lived for a long time in Hollywood. He knows all the stars. But back in Australia a few years ago, or still today, now he's very sick, but every time he would go to Darwin and drink a bit, he will end up in jail. Doesn't matter. He has played in all those Hollywood movies, right? So anyway, you look at Crocodile Dundee, you will see what he's doing there. Then, Werner Herzog. There is, he did a film where you have also Aboriginal actors. Anyway, there was a whole series. But Gulpilpil had a great idea. But there is an anthropologist called Thompson who in the 40s was sent to the Yolngu people, that's north of Australia, by the sea. They are water people, seawater people. And this was to prepare them to fight against Japanese invasion during the Second World War. Well, they were very good warriors already, so it's Thompson that learned a lot. But anyway, every morning he would make them put the flag up. So this has been integrated in a ritual since then. They always have the flag going up and so on. But there was beautiful photos and film footage that was taken by Thompson. He really had a good eye. black and white photos of hunting. And when Warlpiri saw this collection, he asked a filmmaker to make a film out of those photos. And the proposition that was developed by the Yolngu, who all play in their language in that film, was to display a myth. It's a story of a man who had 3 wives. And there is the idea came from the Yolngu, and it's called the Ten Canoes. Anybody has seen the film? Yeah. Again, you can see it, right? And so it's David Warlpiri is the narrator in the film, and the concept of the film, for those who haven't seen it, is part is in black and white, part is in color. Now the black and white, they have chosen 10 Thomson photos of hunting for goose, and the photos are animated by their descendants. It's the sons and grandsons of the hunters of the 40s who were photographed, who played the role. So you start with the photo, and then the film moves, right? And it's a hunt. And during the hunt, the old hunter is telling a story to a young hunter. And the story is intercutting the hunt in color. And it's played by the same people who are in the hunt, but it's in color. It's a beautiful film. It's very, it's made by a non-Aboriginal filmmaker, and so it's a Hollywood movie, but, and the main role is played by the son of David Warlpiri, but the whole idea was designed with the Yolngu. And there's lots of humor in it. And interestingly, people who don't know that it's the Yolngu who wrote the script. I was asked to present this film in France. I don't remember where it was, but there was lots of people. And the reaction of the room was to say that it's politically incorrect. So watch the film and you can discuss it with Dominique and Renato.
Sorry, what's the name?
10 Canoes. And so the Mulka project is the same, Yolngu people. After 10 Canoes, there has been, because the first one was 10 canoes and 3 wives and 11 spears or something like that. So then you had 11 canoes, 12 canoes, 13 canoes on the internet. So there's lots of projects of films that have been done by young Yolngu. And then they developed the Mulka project, and in the Mulka project there are some extraordinary films. We've been using them for teaching in France to my students. Yeah. You know Mulka project? Yeah. No.
It's like something like Indigenous ideas.
Sorry?
Something like a project of Aboriginal directors.
Yeah, they're all Yolngu people. But we really, there's no point talking about it. We really need the internet. I will show you that this afternoon, and then once you have the links, you can explore it yourself. There is a huge amount of stuff on the net with Aboriginal people that they do themselves, little clips with their telephones. And
You have made that Indigenous too, I guess.
yes, yeah, there is this too. Well, behind that there are other politics and so on, but it's like Google was pushing at one stage to have just one portal for all of Indigenous languages, and have to be aware, careful with all those things. It's the same here. Lots of Indigenous groups have been approached by Google Map. So, of course, it's difficult to refuse the computers and so on, but what is the reason for mapping? You were asking this question about secrets of design. More importantly is the secrets of the places, And there's all this business of satellite. It's necessary for land claims, but Aboriginal people don't want it to be available for everybody, because it's too easy. And at the moment, lots of Indigenous groups in the forest are here, or in Amazonia generally, are contacted for that, But it's not to save the Indigenous knowledge. It's to access more easily some of the places. It's very dangerous. Hein?
Bom, acho que a gente né, queria deixar talvez a dedicação um pouco, porque as duas voltam, né? Então, já, né? Quero agradecer muito a Bárbara pela...
If you like, I'll tell you one more thing. You see this picture here? This is a mosaic that is adapted from a painting of Michael Nelson Jacamara in front of the library. It was done in 1988 because it was the bicentenary of occupation of Australia. So it was a feast for the colonizers, but for Aboriginal people it was more a mortuary ritual. But in the 2000s, when the politics were shifting, Michael Nelson, when he came to Canberra, went to the middle of this mosaic and undid it, saying there is no reason for the government to keep it because they have not respected what we were hoping in 1988, which was listed in the statement before. Thank you.